hearing from upstream. Apologies, guys, I jumped one. We're going to be uncovering MCP and LLMs, the blueprint to securing connected vehicles in the agentic era. And we're joined by Sarit Kozakin, the Vice President of Product Management. And with that, Sarit, I'll go ahead and let you take it over.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone that joined the session. I'm Sarit Kozakin, and I'm the VP of Product at Upstream. And I'll be talking about uncovering MCP and LLMs. I'll try to make the most out of the time that we have and cover everything. You're more than welcome to ask questions at the end. Let's start. So I would like to start with the era of physical AI. So mentioning physical AI here is really important, and the focus on it is really important. Physical AI is really the AI that is embedded in devices or in machines that would act through real-life, real-world sensors and actuators. For that, they should leverage a lot of connectivity, a lot of API and MCP, which we'll talk about. So the era of physical AI definitely introduces or drives, the adoption of those type of architectures and infrastructures. And you can see how it's connected to smart mobility. You can see the investments that are going on. This is like, in the rise in the last year. You see those distinguished names like Nissan and Volvo, announcing how they invest in that area. And again, this is a driver for us to make sure that, we're supporting that, that we're protecting it, and that customers can leverage everything that we provide in upstream security. So the era of physical AI and the rise of physical AI is something that also drives introducing new cyber risks. You see things like prompt injection or excessive agency. I'll talk about those in a few minutes, but it's important to see, okay, we are really expanding the attack surface, the attack vectors, and this is how we need to deal with it. So now that we understand, we set the stage, we understand why this is so important, I do want to go and talk about what is MCP. MCP is a model context protocol. So it's really the standard protocol that exposes the models into capabilities, tools, resources. I would like to highlight that you'll see me saying a lot about standards. Okay, the standardization here is really important. It's a standard protocol. We want the AI world and the LLMs to be able to connect to standard tools, to enterprise tools, to external systems. This is why the MCP as a concept is really, really important. And you'll also hear me talking about the bridge. Okay, so it's on one hand, it's a standard protocol. On the other hand, it's serving as a bridge between AI and external systems. So having that as the concept and setting the stage as you see here, we really need to keep in our mind with this new architecture, with this new framework, how do we preserve resilience when autonomous decisions done by the models execute between product systems, between external systems, enterprise tools, etc. So we should keep this in mind, and we'll show, where there are exposures and how we're dealing with those. So looking at it a little bit differently, I said that I'm going to use the word standard and bridge. I think that the summary, to sum it up like in a sentence, it's really bridging models and systems. Okay, today we're using API. API is the standard, but we need another layer in order to really do the bridge between models and systems. So we're talking about how we're building the action layers for AI systems. Again, talking about standards, I think the main theme here is that in order to do the bridge, we need a standard interface that will allow AI agents to seamlessly discover and use enterprise tools. Okay, imagine that an LLM, and I'll show the flow and some use cases, where the LLM needs to try to identify resources, try to identify tools that are needed in order to do the AI workflow. And they will need this ability to really discover and connect to those resources. So this way, as you can see here, we can reduce reasoning complexity for agentic workflows. So I want to talk about complexity, but I will elaborate later on, because I think complexity is very relevant also to the automotive world. So there is complexity that comes with the AI systems, but there's also another type of complexity of how ecosystems, how connected mobility ecosystems would come with their own complexity, and I'll show how they come together. Another thing that is worth mentioning before we move on to the actual workflow that will really illustrate how this works is the stateful interactions. So talking about stateful interactions means that sometimes the agents would connect to a lot of tools, right? Like if we're talking about the LLM as the brain and the agent as the one that operates everything, then there is some complexity in agentic workflows that would require stateful interactions. And this is another thing that we should also refer to. So this is MCP, now like really in high level. If we go into the how it works, and this is the MCP in action, you will see that I talked about the LLM, the brain of everything, the driver of the agentic workflow, and the model would receive a request, would parse it to understand the intent, and would select which tools to use in order to bring the data that is needed or make the action that is needed. It will connect to the agent. You see here the MCP client, the agent, the AI agent is really running through the MCP client, like working with the MCP client. The MCP client would do the discovery, like where should I go? Where should I take this data from? And would send the JSON RPC request to the MCP servers that were discovered, that were mapped. The server will resolve the action, will resolve the operation, the request, and would route it using API. Now we're going deeper into the ecosystem of the enterprise in order to get to the right resource and make the needed action. Now, this is one way getting to what is needed, getting to the data or getting to the prompt that needs to run. The other way around is exactly the opposite. Like once there is a response, the response would go through API, through the MCP server that will forward it to the agents, through the MCP client, and that would be fed back into the LLM in order to complete the workflow to continue reasoning. Okay, so the way we expose the actions through the MCP server to make it available to the LLM, this is the bridge in the standard way that I was talking about earlier. So I think this really illustrates how this should work. It's in the rise, of course, as I said, the whole usage of MCP is in the rise. So attacks, trending attacks should come with it as a natural thing. You can see like from September 2025, for example, the first malicious MCP server that was found, and all other examples of attacks and vulnerabilities against MCP. I'll talk, as I said, like I'll give more examples when we go into the details. Now that we understand what MCP is and what MCP server, MCP client, what they are, I think this is the right time for us to zoom into the cyber risks that are relevant to the connected vehicle ecosystem. So everything that we talked about around MCP and API was relevant as a generic thing. From here and on, I think you'll find this interesting because we are specifically referring to the ecosystem of connected vehicles. Now, there are two things that we want to say here, I think. One is that API and MCP, of course, they continue to serve as the nervous system of automotive, okay, what we call the operational backbone of software-defined mobility platforms and so on. This is noted also in our annual Global Cybersecurity Report, the 2026 report that I urge you to take a look at and read more about it. So we definitely see this as, again, something that is fundamental, something that is extensively used. Now, with the use of it, enabling innovation, okay? It's needed in order to enable innovation. And we also see that it's becoming a dominant exposure point or remaining. It was like, it became earlier an exposure point, and now it's even, being more relevant and increasing. And you can also see that there's a blur between boundaries trust boundaries between the relevant assets and entities that are involved in the ecosystem. So this really shows, again, why this is relevant. It also ties back to the physical AI era that I mentioned earlier. Now, we talked about complexity, and I mentioned that I want to refer to the complexity of the automotive industry. So the automotive industry involves multiple domains, various assets, and by that, it has expanded attack surface. When we talk about domains, we talk about things like vendors that would connect to the enterprise systems, that would connect maybe to the ERP system of the OEM, of the connected mobility company. We see customers connecting through mobile applications, right? That's another connection that increases complexity, increases type of traffic and scope of traffic. We see partners connecting. So all of that is powered, of course, by API and agents and other services, but it shows how complex this is and how much opportunity there is, and that's the expanded attack surface. And because of that, we also see that some of the needs that are out there in order to really map and protect this is OWASP top 10, for example, the API security that we all know, and now with MCP and LLM, top 10 security, top 10 OWASP is very much relevant. It's also relevant to be able to have contextual detection, like understand those flows, understand the context in order to monitor and to protect. Also, it's really important, the need around cross-domain fusion detection. We see a lot of domains. We need to be able to correlate between them. And of course, real-time AI security, as we said, like agentic workflows are very much relevant here, and we need to protect them. So that's the complexity I mentioned. So we have the complexity of agentic workflows, as a whole. I think here it's even more apparent. We talked about some of the terms that I mentioned in the physical AI era and the risks that come with it. I think that it's worth mentioning a few, also part, of course, of the OWASP top 10, the MCP and LLM OWASP top 10. One is the prompt injection. This is like the number one risk that I think is quite trendy. I guess you've encountered it. This is where AI is being tricked into instructions that would leak data, delete data. It's tricked into making unauthorized actions. Again, very trending, very effective, you can say. There's tool poisoning and supply chain. By tool poisoning, this is where the metadata of tools, for example, that the AI would operate would include all kinds of malicious operations. And once the LLM runs it, then it can run those malicious actions. Very much a risk already. The last thing that I think is worth mentioning is the shadow MCP and excessive agency. So shadow MCP is very similar to shadow API that we have today already. Like those are unmanaged, undocumented elements, can be MCP servers, MCP clients. So on its own, it's a risk because they are unmanaged and undocumented, so they are not being monitored. But the other part of it, with excessive agency, we talked about the MCP client, the agent that has the authority and the autonomy to discover tools, to run actions. And it may be an opportunity to bypass IT controls. Okay, so it's beyond what is permitted. this is how, you can overcome it with the excessive agency. So very much relevant as a major risk. All of those are, as I said, part of the OWASP top 10, are trending and are kind of built in when we're talking about an action layer that has this autonomy and authority to make all the actions that I mentioned in the beginning, and I showed how the agentic workflow works. Now, if we're going back to how upstream looks at this, at the connected vehicle ecosystem, we talked about complexity, we talked about mitigating the risks and the built-in risks that are there. I would like to talk about the 3 layers model. The 3 layers model talk about, first of all, the vehicle layer. The vehicle layer, as you can see, or the device in general, but in this case, it's the vehicle layer. It comes with its own data sources, relevant data like telematics, DTC, MQTT, this type of information. And it comes with embedded vulnerabilities. Okay, so that's the layer that you can say the 3rd layer. The 2nd layer in the middle is the cloud backend layer. This is where the cloud systems, the enterprise tools, the tools that help like operate or hold all the data that is relevant to OTA, that is relevant to vehicle remote commands, diagnostics, remote diagnostics, etc. And this is where it can be exploited, right? Like it's really important. It's something that is very major. I also showed it in this slide where we talked about the ecosystem, how, everything runs through that. And the 3rd layer, or the 1st layer, is the application layer, the API layer, where this is relevant for consumers connecting with their vehicles. And that would be more of an API kind of transactions. This is where the data sources are API traffic and MCP traffic. The idea is that we need to protect all those 3 layers. You see, it's different data, different layers, but they all come with their own built-in vulnerabilities and exposures. So I want to talk about how upstream would protect those 3 layers. And we talked about the different data sources and how they can be a little bit overwhelming coming from different layers. And we will need, as I call it, to make sense out of them, okay? Again, if we go back, I can show you, like we're talking about telematics and MQTT, but we're also talking about API transactions. Those are a little bit different in nature and relate to different assets, but we still need to make sense out of them. So the first step for us is to collect this data and make sense out of it. So the way we're doing it, you can see the 3 specific steps here. The first step is to collect, structure, and standardize this. So this raw data. So we're collecting it from the different sources, the examples that you've just seen. We parse it and we normalize it. So for us, we need it to be structured in a way that we can run with it, that we can make sense out of it and use it optimally. That's the first step. The second step is that we're taking this data and we're putting it into or aligning it into our schema. So once it is stored in our schema and framework, this is something that we can work with, right? Like this step is really important because we need to work with that. The last step, and this is something that we have a lot of investment in, and we believe it's major, is the ability for us to classify the data, refine it, and add or enrich it, augmenting it in order to get to some insights. So we're cleansing it, we're enriching it. You'll see examples when in the next step. But I think the main thing here that is worth mentioning is that we're also running what we call Gen AI classification. So we're looking at the data and we're trying to understand what it means. And we classify it in order to identify things that are like high risk, that we need to pay more attention to, right? Like the type of data that we want to focus on, the type of data that may be used for anomalous discovery. So this is a major thing. And again, without collecting, standardizing, aligning the data with the schema, and then trying to refine and classify, without that, that's the major step that we need to do in order to start the process of tracking and monitoring. So the second step, once we have the data in, is really taking this data, what we call AI ready, once it's classified and cleansed, and put it in the context of the live digital twin. So the live digital twin technology is our ability to represent assets, as you can see examples here, like vehicles, like agents, up to the component level, and make sure that we're tracking it in the asset level or even in the groups or cohorts level or fleets of devices or vehicles level. So the live digital twin technology is really the core technology that will allow us to be stateful, that will allow us to look at things over time, to track specific assets or group of assets. The things that we would track, the things that we would record inside this representation would be things like raw signals, like temperature and speed, inferred data, like location-based speed, events like OTA updates or DTCs that were recorded, drive start as an action. Those are the events that we care about. And then we can also see if there are anomalies, unexpected ETCs, excessive number of response codes, like things that we believe are not regular or usual, and track them as anomalies on the live digital twin, and also enrich it with external data. So external data, IP reputation, for example, can be external data that would really help us to analyze, and we'll talk about like detect, investigate, and respond. So definitely for the investigation part, would allow us also to see all the enriched data, and by that to analyze and evaluate anomalies. So that's the live digital twin. Again, the stateful analysis of it, this is the core of our functionality, the core of our technology. The last step is bringing everything together. So we did a deep dive on which type of API traffic, MCP traffic, which type of data we're going to ingest, we're going to consume, the platform will consume. We do the data ingestion with the structuring of it, parsing it, normalizing it, and classifying it. And then it would feed into the live digital twin, as I just showed. And we'll do the discovery in order to understand which elements, which like API and agent catalog, which elements are relevant. Now, once this is ready, we can run the detection, investigation, and response, all of them powered by either ML or Gen AI. Detection is looking at anomalies, looking for shadow elements, shadow assets. Investigation would be within the live digital twin, within the data that the platform holds, to run investigation and understand is it like a false positive or true positive? Is it something that we need to drill down more into? Is this like what are the relevant outcomes of the detection? And then the response would be the operational activity that we would connect to through the integration hub to systems like SIMSOAR and other systems that may be relevant as part of the response. So that's like bringing everything together. One thing that I think is relevant is also looking into, I talked about stateful analysis of the live digital twin. And I think this is really important to highlight that when we're talking about the stateful analysis, it allows us to look at type of attacks beyond the OWASP, meaning things that are more continuous, things that are more stateful. In this specific example, if you're looking at pair transaction or pair activity, they may look okay to you. Okay, for example, if the user is connecting with a temporary disposable email, okay, doesn't mean a lot on its own. But if you're looking at the chain of events and we're able to track that in a stateful way through the live digital twin technology, then we're saying, okay, there's a disposable email here. There's a source IP with bad reputation. We talked about how we can enrich the data and identify that. We look at unofficial companion app used at some point. And then there's multiple pairing requests to new vehicles, to multiple new vehicles, which also on its own, it's maybe suspicious, but not strong enough. And then we also see unauthorized servers response codes, okay? All of that as chain of events would indicate that we're looking at a user maliciously attempting to control vehicles remotely. On its own, like every item on its own, every activity on its own, would not be that, would not be that strong, would not be that deterministic. This way, we can be, what we call low and slow attacks over time, we can identify them, we can detect them. I think this is really strong, again, based on everything we talked about, right? Like the live digital twin, the way we collect the data, the way we're stateful and having all the context. This is the thing that, I wanted to highlight as major. Now, I do want just to summarize, we talked about physical AI, MCP, and API, how they're relevant. We talked about the risks, and we talked about the upstream platform and how we can mitigate those risks. Just to wrap up, increased risk, MCP systems are APIs controlled by LLM, API evolving with MCP to the physical AI era, and being, of course, influenced by LLM. It combines API risk with new types of risk, such as prompt injection, excessive agency, tools poisoning, etc. I gave those examples. I urge you to read more about it. Very relevant, very trending. And I think the bottom line is how upstream looks at it, like behavioral security, stateful behavior security. We monitor API and MCP and help mitigate many of those risks, many of those threats. Okay, so this is it, MCP and LLMs and how they're relevant to you guys. I hope you found it interesting. I know that we have a few more minutes. Is there anything that I can answer?
So we did receive one question. What is the difference between the different WASP lists?
Okay, so I mentioned both. Like there's the OS Top 10 API security, which existed before and very much still relevant. As we said, APIs and MCP, they go together, and this is very much relevant. There are the top 10 for LLM and top 10 for MCP. There is some overlap between them, but the idea is that the LLM security and the OS Top 10 for LLM security is more about the applications using AI and how they are, like the vulnerabilities and exposures that are relevant to them. When we're talking about MCP, we're talking about MCP security, that's like the layer beneath that, like the whole, like the API with the agent, with the whole setup that I talked about, the whole elements, how you need to protect them and how they are exposed. That's pretty much the main difference between both.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that clarification, and thank you very much, Sarit, for joining us today. This has been a fantastic presentation. I encourage all of our attendees to hop on over to the Upstream virtual booth if you're interested in learning more about what their products and what they have to offer, if you would like to connect with their staff. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us following Partners Week, and we're happy to make those introductions. Thanks again once more for your time and your expertise, Sarit.